Hi, I'm Michelle Paganini from Paganoonoo. I'm an upcycle fashion designer and I love upcycling, so I'm here to share today with you a tip on upcycling that's one of my favorites for adding a little design element to the shirts that I make. I tend to work with men's shirts because the quality of the construction is good, the stitching is good, the fabric is good, and so they make a really great base to work on to make women's shirts. And so I'm going to show you some examples of my work that already have applique on them. So here's one that's a very high contrast, which adds a lot of interest. There's even a little sparkle on here. I actually used a skirt for this one. And on the back, there's a very large motif, which is the feature of the back. This one, what a great place to show off some machine embroidery. Look at how gorgeous that parrot looks on this flannel. And the blue makes it perfect for wearing with blue jeans. Since it's such a focal point on this one, I decided to really only do one other one up here that's fairly subtle. So you want to look and see where are you directing the eye when you're putting it on. This one, it's moving you up, the smaller one to the bigger one. This is an example of what we're actually going to do, which is a triple reverse applique, where the edges are left raw and you can see the top fabric and two different fabrics, and notice how I've played with the stripes. So again, the eye kind of comes up and moves around. So we're going to look at that. This is the shirt we're going to work on. So I've done two examples already on here, and we're going to put a third element on, much as I've done on the other shirts, to draw the eye up. So I want to tell you one of the first things I do when I'm checking out colors and I'm deciding what to do. I use whatever's at hand, be it a canning jar lid or a cookie cutter, to cut out some circles. And it makes a lot of sense to use different sizes because it's much more interesting to the eye. So I tend to use at least 3 different sizes, and I work in groupings that are traditional for design elements, which is 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, which are more interesting to the eye than even numbers. So I'll cut out some elements. You can see right here some test elements. And what I have is things that I cut out from 2 other men's shirts. And if I'm deciding where to place it, I put my shirt on a dress form if I have one, and I use it like a felt board to just put the circles and see, do I like that? Do I want to switch it around? You know, what would it look like if I have it on there? And that's how I make my decision. So on this one, I want to have the eye drawn up. And I like the placement right there, so I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. And I'm ready to go. The next step is to take the shirt and actually mark where this is. And I'm going to get the tracing mechanism on there and trace it on here. So I can see exactly where I want my circle placed. So I've got that on there. And then I'm going to cut out a square of fabric. I don't want to use the exact circle because I'm coming from underneath. So I'm going to cut away after I do the stitching. So I want extra edges on there. So I'm going to start with a piece of fabric, and I'm going to leave at least 1 inch, maybe more, along the edges. Just rough cut it, and then I'm going to put it under here, and we'll trim it after we're done. The next step is to interface. It's a choice to interface or not. I tend to do that because otherwise you get some wrinkling. So in this case, I've cut out interfacing. You can see that I have the tracing right on here. I'm going to finish the interfacing. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm actually going to stitch all the way around it. And that way, when I turn it over and I'm looking from the underside and I'm trying to match this circle, I'm going to know exactly where my circle is. It's easier than trying to trace exactly from the other side. So just use a straight stitch and go around. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to show. I'm going to start the stitching, and remember, it doesn't really have to be perfect. I'm pivoting so that I can actually match the circle, and I have my needle down. If you have that feature on your machine, you might want to try the same thing. It makes it a lot easier to always stop with the needle down when you're pivoting for a circle. Oops. Let me reposition it. There we go. All right, I'm almost to the end. I'll just clip the threads and show you what I've got. Picked up a needle magnetically. Okay, so let's see what it looks like on the back side. Once I've gotten the threads out of the way. You can see that it's rough. That doesn't matter. That tells me where the circle is in the dimension. It's the same size as this one, roughly. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. I'm going to layer the second piece on top of it. So I'm going to do something very similar to this one, which means I need 2 layers. I'm not going to interface this one. I think I'd like the softer look because it's going to fray. So again, I'm going to look and see and make sure that I have enough edging around there so that I'm not at risk of going off the edge. And I can place it approximately where I want to use it. And if I stick my finger right on the edge and I lift this up, I can see where I am in relation to the stitching, how close I am. Another way to mark it that makes it a little bit easier is to just put a pin on 2 of the sides. I'll put it on this side. And then match it up. So I can see that I've got that one right. And that one's pretty close too. So I'm actually in good shape. At that point, I can pin the middle. And a few on the outside just to hold it in place. You don't want the fabric shifting as you're doing the stitching because you'll get a bubble and have to rip it out and do it over again. Doesn't hurt even to give it a quick press just to kind of fuse the layers together. All right, so now we're going to stop and we're going to set up the machine for free motion stitching. All right, here we go. I'm roughly following the circle. Doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to ring around it 3 times like a moon forming an eclipse around the planet. Overlapping. I'm also going to stop and I'm going to clip the thread, the starting thread, so that it doesn't get caught up in the other threads. At this point I can remove all my pins. I've done my first round and I'm now going to go around a few more times. I'm not going to try and stitch right on top of where I stitched before, but a little bit to the outside edge to give it a more artistic look. So I'll go a little in, a little out. Coming around for the 3rd time. And I find that 3 layers as opposed to 1 or 2 gives it a more cohesive look and also is much more forgiving of any wiggles that happened, if they were unintentional. I wiggled on purpose to mimic that effect. So we've got the 3 stitches. Let's take a look and see what we've got. Actually came out kind of nicely. I like that. You can see with the one that I have above that it also went around and had some wiggles in it, but that's part of the charm of it. So what we can also see is, whoops, didn't clip the thread. On the back side, we've got a lot there that we don't need. So we can go ahead and trim that at this point, being very careful not to cut the shirt itself, and just get this out of the way. And we're going to leave some edge on there. Oops, almost have it all. Okay, so I've roughly cut it. You could pink it and that would help it fraying. Turn it over, and this is what it looks like when 1 layer's cut away. Here's what it looks like when 2 layers are cut away. Let me show you what I did. I left a lip. I did not cut right next to the stitching, so I left a little bit of lip on the fabric itself, and I left a lip on the second fabric so that you can actually see all 3 fabrics together. So let's cut away a layer and see what that looks like. You really want to be careful that you pull out just 1 layer at a time. So if you grab it and pull it, you can kind of feel with your fingers if you have 1 layer on top or you have 2. And you can clip right in the middle of it to give yourself a place to start. And then cut around the edge. Again, you don't have to be perfect with this. You're leaving a lip. You get to decide how much. You could do this with pinking shears. It's a little tougher. It gives an interesting effect. But I'm going to give you a tip on how to keep it from fraying too badly. Okay, so we have our first layer, and then we still have the striped fabric underneath to get to. But that doesn't look bad in and of itself. In fact, it would be kind of interesting with those two. However, we've got the bottom layer and we want to see what that looks like too. So again, I'm going to pull it apart, make sure that I only have the second layer of fabric. I'm going to make a lip that gives enough to see inside of the existing lip that's already there. Don't worry if it doesn't clip just right when you're doing it, because you can clean it up a little bit later. I'm going to assess them and see if there's any place I need to go back and trim. Like right here, it's very rough. And I've got a little bit of a dip right here. I don't like that. So I'm going to clean that up just a little bit. And this is an excellent point. You can see right here that I have a whisker starting already on the fabric. When you're cutting fabric on a circle, some of it's going to be on the bias and some of it's going to be on the straight of grain, which means it's going to fray nicely at the bias parts, but on the straight of grain, you're going to get whiskers like this. So here's a trick for you if you have not used pinking shears. If you go around and you just make a minuscule, like a 1/16 of an inch clip all the way around, it makes a big difference in the way that it frays. So you can do that on this edge, you can do it on the inside edge, and you'll also have to do a little maintenance on this. Once you've washed it, you'll get a little bit of fraying, and you may want to keep that, and you may not want to keep the fraying. It's up to you. Let me show you some examples of a test panel that I did. I like to just see what the different techniques look like. So I've made a sample up here. And one of the things I looked at is what kind of difference does it make when you use interfacing or don't. You can see this one looks a little bit pebbly, which might be an effect that you want, and it might be an effect that you don't want. On this one with stripes, I played with what happens if I actually stitch over the stripes and what kind of texture does that give it. This is just a plain raw edge on the top. It's actually not even reverse applique. Here's one where I clipped the edges to see what that would look like. Just a smallish one. Another one with a stripe where I actually went down both sides of the window pane stripe to see what kind of effect that would give. And then I like to play with men's shirts a lot because of the different patterns. This one has a stripe and I've made it go two ways, and I really like that effect of having the same fabric but having it go two different ways. And that's how easy it is when you do an upcycle project to add a little flair to it with reverse applique.